This bear's life was almost over. Now she has a pond and a loving family. Mist clung to the mountains of Colorado, obscuring the winding road that snaked through the pines. It was on this road in the cold light of dawn that Park Ranger Jim Henson spotted something unusual in the ditch. At first, he thought it might be a discarded trash bag or perhaps a dark boulder that had tumbled down from the slope above. But as he pulled his truck to the shoulder and approached, his stomach tightened. There, lying motionless against the dirt, was a small black bear cub. "Jesus Christ," Jim muttered, immediately reaching for his radio. The cub's condition was horrific. Deep grooves encircled its neck and limbs, unmistakable marks left by chains. One hind leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and its black fur was matted with blood and filth. But it was the eyes that disturbed Jim the most. When the cub briefly opened them at the sound of his approach, there was nothing there, no fear, no aggression, just vacant pools reflecting nothing but trauma. Within hours, the bear cub was transported to Pine Ridge Wildlife Rescue Center, where head veterinarian Dr. Melissa Young performed an initial assessment. Male, approximately 6 months old, she dictated as her assistant took notes. Severe lacerations consistent with prolonged restraint, malnourished, dehydrated, and showing signs of psychological trauma. Compound fracture to the left hind leg. She paused, her gloved hand gently brushing over the cub's head. Prognosis: poor. Recommend humane euthanasia following the mandatory 48-hour holding period. Her assistant Nancy looked up with a frown. "Already? Couldn't we try, Nancy?" Dr. Young interrupted softly. "You know as well as I do that a wild animal with this level of physical and psychological damage can never be successfully rehabilitated and released. We're overflowing with cases that have genuine chances of survival. It would be cruel to prolong his suffering." The bear cub was logged into the system, given the temporary name Kuma, Japanese for bear, by one of the volunteers who had recently returned from Japan and placed in an isolation unit. His paperwork was marked with a red tag, scheduled for euthanasia in 48 hours. 400 miles away, in a rustic cabin nestled in the Wyoming mountains, Ethan Carter squinted at the numbers on his laptop screen. Their first independent wildlife research project was proving more challenging than either he or his wife had anticipated. Fresh out of graduate school with their respective degrees in veterinary medicine and wildlife biology, Ethan and Sophie had secured a modest grant to study the migratory patterns of elk in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The data they'd collected over the past 3 months was promising, but their funding was running dangerously low. "Sophie," Ethan called out, rubbing his tired eyes, "did we budget for a new camera trap? The one on the North Ridge is malfunctioning again." When no answer came, Ethan rose from his makeshift desk, a weathered pine table positioned by the cabin's largest window, and made his way to the kitchen. There, he found his wife, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, hunched over her phone with tears streaming down her face. "What's wrong?" The alarm shot through him as he rushed to her side. Sophie looked up, her blue eyes swimming with emotion. "It's Lisa from the Rescue Network. She just sent me this." She held up her phone, displaying a photo of a small black bear, battered and broken, lying on an examination table. "His name is Kuma. He was found chained up somewhere, probably as an illegal pet. They're going to put him down tomorrow." Ethan took the phone, studying the image with his professional eye. He felt a swell of anger at whoever had done this to the animal, followed by the resigned sadness that often accompanied his work in wildlife conservation. Poor little guy. Though honestly, Soph, euthanasia might be the kindest option here. Those injuries look severe. How can you say that? Sophie snatched her phone back. He deserves a chance. Lisa says he's young, maybe 6 months old. With proper care, he could recover. And then what? Ethan asked gently. You know as well as I do that bears with this level of human contact almost never successfully reintegrate into the wild. He'd live his life in captivity, which is exactly what caused his suffering in the first place. Sophie was quiet for a moment, her fingers hovering over her phone screen as she stared at the image of the wounded cub. Then, with sudden determination, she began typing rapidly. What are you doing? Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. Contacting Wild Heart Sanctuary, Sophie replied without looking up. They have a special rehabilitation program for apex predators. Maybe they can take him, or at least advise us on how to help. Ethan sighed. Sophie, we can't just let him, she interrupted, her voice cracking. Not without trying. Please, Ethan. We have the training. We have the space. It would just be temporary, until he's well enough to transfer to a permanent facility. Looking at his wife's pleading face, Ethan felt his resolve weakening. This wasn't the first time Sophie had brought home an injured creature. Their college apartment had been a rotating hospital for everything from orphan squirrels to a one-eyed hawk. But a black bear was different. It was dangerous, complicated, and potentially illegal without the proper permits. Yet he also knew that beneath Sophie's emotional response lay genuine expertise. She'd specialized in wildlife rehabilitation during her studies, and her thesis on trauma recovery in predator species had been published in a respected journal. If anyone could help this bear, it was Sophie. Let me make some calls, he conceded, already mentally calculating how they'd need to adjust their budget and research schedule. But Sophie, if we do this, we have to be clear, Kuma is not a pet. We rehabilitate him properly, following all protocols, and then we let him go. Sophie nodded vigorously, hope lighting up her tear-stained face. Agreed. Completely professional. I promise. What followed was 48 hours of frantic phone calls, emergency permit applications, and hasty construction of a temporary enclosure behind their cabin. Wild Heart Sanctuary couldn't take Kuma immediately but agreed to supervise his rehabilitation remotely if Ethan and Sophie could provide daily updates and follow their strict protocols. Yang at Pine Ridge was initially resistant to the idea, but eventually relented when presented with the couple's credentials and the sanctuary's endorsement. 3 days after Sophie first saw his photo, Kuma arrived at their mountain cabin in a specialized transport crate. The wildlife officer who delivered him looked skeptical as he handed over a thick folder of paperwork. You sure you folks know what you're getting into? He asked, eyeing the hastily constructed enclosure. This ain't like rehabilitating a deer or even a wolf. Bears are different. Smarter. They remember. We understand, Ethan assured him, signing the final transfer documents. We've worked with black bears before during our internships at Yellowstone. The officer nodded, though his expression remained doubtful. Well, good luck. The sanctuary will be checking in, and I'll be back in 2 weeks for the first evaluation. Remember, any sign that this animal can't be eventually released back to the wild, and we have to consider other options. As the officer's truck disappeared down the gravel road, Sophie approached the transport crate with slow, deliberate movements. Hey, Kuma, she whispered, kneeling beside the mesh window. We're going to help you get better. Inside the crate, the bear cub lay motionless, his eyes fixed on nothing. Transferring Kuma to his new enclosure proved easier than anticipated, not because he was cooperative, but because he offered no resistance whatsoever. He simply lay where they placed him on the soft bedding of pine needles and straw, his breathing shallow, his gaze vacant. "It's like he's not even in there?" Sophie whispered that evening as they observed him through the reinforced glass panel they'd installed in the enclosure wall. "It's just his body." Ethan nodded grimly. "Classic dissociation. It's a survival mechanism. His mind has retreated from the trauma." He wrapped an arm around Sophie's shoulders. "The first step is getting him physically stable. Let's start with the treatment plan Dr. Young prescribed for his leg and those wounds." The following days established a routine. Mornings began with Sophie preparing Kuma's medications and special dietary supplements while Ethan checked and reinforced the enclosure. They would then work together to administer treatment, a challenging task that required patience, protective equipment, and the occasional use of a gentle snare pole. Kuma never fought them, but he never acknowledged them either. He accepted food mechanically when it was placed before him, chewing without apparent taste or pleasure, before retreating to the furthest corner of his enclosure. At night, however, something changed. They first noticed it on the fourth night, when a series of low moans and growls woke them from sleep. Racing to the window that overlooked the enclosure, they found Kuma thrashing in his sleep, his limbs jerking as if fighting against invisible restraints. "He's having nightmares," Sophie whispered, her hand pressed against the glass. "Should we wake him?" "No," Ethan said firmly. "It would just frighten him more. But I have an idea." The next day, Ethan installed an infrared camera system inside the enclosure, allowing them to monitor Kuma without disturbing him. For 3 nights they watched as the same pattern emerged. Kuma would fall asleep, remain peaceful for approximately 40 minutes, then begin a cycle of distressed movements, flinching, growling, and making aborted attempts to run or climb. "It's PTSD," Ethan concluded as they reviewed the footage. "He's reliving whatever happened to him." Sophie's face was drawn with concern. "How do we help him with that? It's not like we can offer him therapy." Ethan was quiet for a moment, his mind working through the problem. "Maybe we can give him more agency. That's often key in trauma recovery, restoring a sense of control." The following day they restructured Kuma's enclosure, making it more complex with different levels, textures, and hidden food sources that required problem-solving to access. Ethan spent hours constructing a physical rehabilitation system using recycled materials, a series of graduated obstacles that would gently encourage Kuma to use his injured leg without forcing him. Sophie, meanwhile, focused on nutrition. The standard rehabilitation diet wasn't working. Kuma would barely touch the commercial bear feed mixed with native vegetation that was protocol. After consulting with Wild Heart Sanctuary, Sophie began experimenting with different foods. It was purely by chance that she discovered Kuma's preferences. While preparing her own lunch one day, she dropped a handful of blueberries. To her astonishment, Kuma immediately perked up, his nostrils flaring as he tracked the scent. "Ethan," she called excitedly. "Look at this." They watched in amazement as Kuma actually moved toward the front of the enclosure, his nose working overtime as he sought the source of the enticing smell. When Sophie cautiously offered the berries through the feeding hatch, Kuma accepted them with what almost looked like enthusiasm. Blueberries, Ethan marveled, of all things. Further experimentation revealed that Kuma would also eat honey, not just accept it, but actively seek it out. Sophie immediately adjusted his diet plan, incorporating these preferred foods while gradually introducing other nutritional elements. The sanctuary coordinator says we need to be careful not to create food associations that wouldn't exist in the wild, Sophie told Ethan as she prepared Kuma's evening meal. But blueberries and honey are natural parts of a black bear's diet, so we're good. Every detail of Kuma's care was meticulously recorded in a journal Sophie kept beside their bed. She documented everything: his food intake, physical measurements, behavioral changes, medication responses, and even the subtle shifts in his eyes. Pages filled with observations, theories, and small victories: the first time Kuma put weight on his injured leg, the morning he explored the climbing structure Ethan had built, the day he voluntarily entered the small pool they had installed. But progress was not linear. Some days Kuma seemed more present, more engaged with his surroundings. Other days he retreated into that vacant state, curling into a tight ball in the darkest corner of his enclosure, unresponsive to any stimulus. On those difficult days, Sophie would sit for hours by the observation window, just talking to him in a soft, steady voice. "My mom used to take me hiking in places like this," she told him one evening, her breath fogging the glass between them. She loved the mountains, said they had souls older than anything else on earth. Sophie paused, watching as Kuma's ear twitched slightly, the only indication he might be listening. "She died when I was 10. Climbing accident. A storm came in suddenly and she..." Sophie's voice caught. "Anyway, that's why I became a wildlife biologist. She always said nature wasn't cruel, just honest. I wanted to prove her right, I guess." Ethan, passing by with an armload of firewood, paused in the doorway. He'd heard Sophie mention her mother before, of course, but never with such raw vulnerability. Quietly, he set down the wood and retreated, giving her the privacy of this moment with Kuma. What neither of them realized then was that Sophie's healing had become intertwined with Kuma's. Each small improvement in the bear's condition seemed to lift something in Sophie as well, as if by saving him, she was addressing that deep-seated longing to save someone from the perceived cruelty of nature that had taken her mother. 6 weeks into Kuma's rehabilitation, tensions began to rise between Ethan and Sophie. Their research project had taken a backseat to Kuma's care, and their grant funds were dwindling faster than anticipated. The weekly check-ins with Wild Heart Sanctuary had become increasingly focused on the timeline for Kuma's transfer to a permanent facility, something Sophie consistently found reasons to postpone. "He's not ready," she insisted after one particularly tense video call. "His leg still needs at least another month of physical therapy, and he's just starting to show normal foraging behaviors." "Sophie," Ethan said carefully, "the sanctuary coordinator agrees that his physical recovery is progressing well. They have expert staff who can continue his rehabilitation. We always knew this was temporary." "But they don't know him like we do," Sophie protested. "They haven't seen how he freezes up around strangers or how he only eats when I prepare his food a certain way." Ethan ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "That's exactly the problem. He's becoming too habituated to us. To you specifically. The longer he stays, the harder it will be for him to ever function as a wild bear." The argument escalated, with Sophie eventually storming out of the cabin in tears. She walked the perimeter of their property in the fading light, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Why couldn't Ethan understand? Kuma needed them. He was special. The connection they'd formed wasn't inappropriate, it was necessary for his healing. Lost in these thoughts, Sophie didn't notice the time passing until darkness had fully settled. Returning to the cabin, she found it empty. A note on the kitchen counter informed her that Ethan had gone to check their research cameras and would be back late. Feeling drained and emotional, Sophie made her way to Kuma's enclosure. The bear was awake, pacing slowly along the back wall. When Sophie approached the observation window, he paused, his head tilting slightly as if recognizing her presence. "Hey buddy," she said softly, pressing her palm against the glass. "Sorry about all the yelling earlier. Ethan just doesn't understand yet." To her surprise, Kuma moved toward her, not with his usual hesitance, but with deliberate steps. He approached the window and, for the first time, made direct eye contact with her. Something in that gaze pierced straight through Sophie's defenses. There was awareness there, and something else she couldn't quite name. Overcome, Sophie sank to the floor, her back against the wall, and began to cry. For her mother. For Kuma. For the argument with Ethan. For all of it. She cried until her throat ached, curled up against the observation window, unaware that inside the enclosure, Kuma had settled into a similar position on the other side of the glass. When her tears finally subsided, Sophie looked up to find Kuma watching her intently. Then, as if making a decision, he moved to the small access hatch used for feeding, a reinforced door with a tray that could slide between the enclosure and the outside. With one paw, he gently pushed against it. Sophie hesitated. Opening the hatch when not feeding Kuma was against protocol. But something in his demeanor called to her. Carefully, she released the external lock and slid the tray halfway, creating a small opening while maintaining the safety barrier. Through this opening, Kuma slowly extended his paw. He didn't swipe or grab. He simply held it there, as if an offering. With trembling fingers, Sophie reached toward him, expecting him to withdraw. Instead, Kuma, gently, so gently, brushed his paw against her hand. A brief, soft contact that lasted only seconds before he pulled back and retreated to his bed of straw. Sophie sat frozen, her fingertips tingling where they had touched Kuma's fur. It wasn't just that he had initiated contact. It was the unmistakable intentionality behind the gesture, comfort, connection, understanding. When Ethan returned an hour later, he found Sophie at the kitchen table, her eyes red but clear, a newfound determination in her expression. "Ethan," she said before he could speak, "I need to show you something." The following weeks brought dramatic changes in Kuma's condition. The vacant look that had haunted his eyes gradually gave way to alert curiosity. His movements became more fluid as his injured leg healed, and his nightmares, while not entirely gone, decreased in both frequency and intensity. Most significantly, he began exhibiting natural behaviors that had been absent before, scent-marking trees within his enclosure, digging shallow pits for cooling, and showing appropriate caution around unfamiliar objects. Ethan, having witnessed the remarkable connection between Kuma and Sophie on that emotional night, threw himself into developing more sophisticated rehabilitation tools. He constructed an artificial stream that ran through part of the enclosure, complete with hidden compartments where they could place live fish, encouraging Kuma to practice the hunting skills he would need in the wild. The sanctuary coordinator says his progress is exceptional, Ethan reported after their weekly video call. "They're impressed with our documentation and methodology." Sophie looked up from where she was preparing Kuma's afternoon meal, a carefully balanced mixture that now included a wider variety of foods native to the region. "Did they mention a timeline for transfer?" Ethan hesitated. "They did, actually. They think he might be ready in about a month, provided his progress continues at this rate. To his surprise, Sophie nodded thoughtfully. That seems reasonable. I've been thinking a lot about what's best for him, and you were right. We need to be preparing him for life beyond us. Relieved by her change in perspective, Ethan wrapped his arms around her. I'm proud of you, sophomore. I know how much you care about him. Sophie leaned into the embrace. I still do, but that moment when he reached out to me, it wasn't about dependency. It was like he was telling me that he understood what I was going through. She pulled back slightly to look at Ethan. It made me realize that true rehabilitation isn't about making him need us, it's about helping him find his strength again. Their renewed unity and focus accelerated Kuma's progress. They expanded his enclosure to include more natural terrain, reduced their direct interactions, and began the delicate process of creating negative associations with humans other than themselves. It was a necessary step in preparing him for eventual release. Dr. Young from Pineridge Wildlife Center visited in the 3rd month, barely concealing her astonishment at Kuma's transformation. I wouldn't have believed it if I wasn't seeing it with my own eyes, she admitted as they observed Kuma skillfully fishing in the artificial stream. When I first examined him, I was certain euthanasia was the only humane option. He just needed time, Sophie said, unable to keep the pride from her voice, and the right environment to heal. Dr. Young nodded thoughtfully. Well, you've certainly provided that. In fact, your methods here could be valuable to other rehabilitation programs. Have you considered publishing your findings? The suggestion sparked a new dimension to their work. In the evenings, after tending to Kuma and their research projects, Ethan and Sophie began compiling their notes and observations into a formal study. Sophie's detailed journal became the foundation for what they hoped would eventually become a published paper on trauma recovery in captive-born predators. It was during this period of focused work and planning that the letter arrived, an official communication from the International Wildlife Conservation Alliance. They want to, what? Sophie asked incredulously as Ethan read the letter aloud. Transfer Kuma to their breeding facility in British Columbia, Ethan repeated, his eyes scanning the formal language. They're establishing a genetic diversity program for American black bears, focusing specifically on bears that can't be released into the wild. They're offering state-of-the-art facilities, lifetime care, and, he paused, his eyebrows rising, a significant research grant for us to continue our work with full access to study Kuma and the other bears in their program. Sophie took the letter, reading it for herself. But we've been working toward releasing him back to the wild. He's made so much progress. I know, Ethan said, his tone measured, but we have to consider all options. The sanctuary was never meant to be permanent, and there are still concerns about his ability to survive independently. This would give him a protected environment while contributing to conservation efforts. Sophie set the letter down, her expression troubled. They want to use him for breeding. That means permanent captivity. It's a highly ethical facility, Ethan pointed out, and the offspring would be part of reintroduction programs. It's not like he'd be in a zoo. The proposal created a new tension between them. Ethan saw the practical benefits, a secure future for Kuma, financial support for their research, and the opportunity to expand their work to benefit more animals. Sophie, however, couldn't shake the feeling that they would be betraying Kuma's trust and the progress he'd made toward recovery. We'd be giving up on him, she argued one evening as they sat on the cabin's porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. After everything he's overcome, we'd be saying he's still not good enough for a real life in the wild. Ethan sighed, reaching for her hand. That's not what we'd be saying at all. We'd be acknowledging that his early trauma has left him with limitations. There's no shame in that. But how do we know? Sophie persisted. How can we be certain he can't make it out there if we don't give him the chance? Their debate continued for days, with neither fully convincing the other. The sanctuary coordinator advised that while Kuma had made remarkable progress, his early captivity and human imprinting still made him a high-risk candidate for full release. The Alliance's breeding program represented a compromise, a purpose-driven life that would contribute to conservation while keeping him safe. As the deadline for their decision approached, nature intervened in an unexpected way. The storm began in the late afternoon, a common summer thunderstorm that rapidly intensified into something more severe. By nightfall, rain was pounding against the cabin roof with alarming force, and flash flood warnings were being issued for the surrounding valleys. I need to check the research cameras, Ethan shouted over the howling wind. The one near the creek might get washed away if the water rises. Be careful, Sophie urged, helping him into his rain gear. The trails will be treacherous. After Ethan left, Sophie busied herself securing the cabin, checking windows, placing buckets under minor leaks, and monitoring the weather reports on their satellite radio. When a particularly violent gust of wind shook the entire structure, she made her way to Kuma's enclosure to ensure it remained intact. What she found sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the rain seeping through her clothes. The reinforced door of the enclosure was open, swinging loosely on its hinges where the wind had apparently caught it. Inside, the enclosure was empty. Kuma, Sophie called out, panic rising in her throat. She spun in a circle, scanning the darkness beyond the cabin, but the driving rain made visibility nearly impossible. Kuma. Her first instinct was to call Ethan, but their satellite phone showed no signal. The storm had knocked out communications. Sophie's mind raced through the possibilities. A loose bear in these conditions could travel miles before morning. He might encounter humans or other predators, or simply succumb to the elements in his confusion. Grabbing a flashlight and emergency kit, Sophie set out into the storm. She followed the most logical path Kuma might have taken, toward the dense forest at the edge of their property where he often gazed during his time in the enclosure. The rain was relentless, soaking through her jacket within minutes and turning the ground into treacherous mud that pulled at her boots with each step. Kuma, she continued to call, though her voice was swallowed by the storm. Where are you? An hour into her search with no sign of the bear and her strength flagging, Sophie realized she had wandered farther than intended. The landmarks she normally used to navigate were invisible in the darkness and rain. Worse, she was beginning to feel lightheaded, a familiar warning sign of her blood sugar dropping dangerously low. Sophie reached for the emergency kit strapped to her belt, but her numb fingers fumbled with the clasp. The glucose tablets she always carried slipped from her grasp, instantly disappearing into the mud at her feet. A wave of dizziness washed over her and she staggered against a tree trunk. Need to get back, she mumbled, but the words slurred together. She took a few more unsteady steps before her knees buckled. As consciousness began to fade, Sophie thought she glimpsed a dark shape moving through the trees toward her, but then the world went black. The first thing Sophie became aware of was warmth, unexpected, enveloping warmth, despite the sound of rain still drumming somewhere nearby. Then came the sensation of movement, a gentle rocking that seemed to be carrying her forward. Finally, As her mind slowly cleared, she realized she was being supported, half-carried, through the forest. "Ethan," she murmured, her voice barely audible. The response was not her husband's voice but a low rumbling sound that vibrated against her side. Sophie's eyes flew open in shock. Kuma. The bear was beside her, his massive shoulder supporting her weight, one paw occasionally reaching out to steady her when she stumbled. His fur was soaked, his eyes intent on the path ahead, which Sophie now recognized as leading back toward the cabin. "Kuma," she whispered, disbelief overwhelming her. "What are you doing?" The bear gave no indication of understanding her words, but he maintained his careful pace, guiding her through the storm with uncanny purpose. When Sophie's legs threatened to give out again, he adjusted his position to provide more support, never once showing aggression or impatience. They emerged from the forest to find Ethan's frantic figure darting around the cabin yard, a powerful searchlight in his hands. "Sophie," he shouted when the beam caught them, then with visible shock, "Kuma." What followed was a blur of movement and emotion, Ethan rushing toward them, hesitating briefly at the sight of the massive bear supporting his wife, Sophie's weak reassurance that Kuma wasn't threatening her, the careful transfer of her weight from bear to husband, and then, most astonishing of all, Kuma following them into the cabin without hesitation. Not with the tentative curiosity of a wild animal exploring a human dwelling, but with the focused concern of a being with a specific purpose. Once inside, Ethan quickly assessed Sophie's condition. Severe hypoglycemia, he concluded, already reaching for the emergency glucose kit they kept in the kitchen. "Sophie, did you go out without checking your levels first?" Sophie nodded weakly as he administered the glucose gel. "I was so worried about Kuma I didn't think." "Well, it seems Kuma was worried about you too," Ethan replied, his voice tinged with wonder as he looked at the bear, who had settled himself by the fireplace, his dark eyes fixed on Sophie with unmistakable vigilance. As Sophie's condition stabilized and the full story emerged, how Kuma had not fled into the wilderness but had somehow sensed her danger and tracked her through the storm, a profound shift occurred in their understanding of the situation. "He didn't escape," Ethan said quietly as they watched Kuma dozing by the fire, utterly at ease in their presence. "He broke out to find you." The implications of this behavior, unprecedented in rehabilitation cases, kept them awake long after the storm had passed. By morning, they had reached a decision about Kuma's future that neither had anticipated. 2 weeks later, they stood at the entrance to Whispering Pines Wildlife Sanctuary in Montana, a specialized facility dedicated to bears that fell into the complicated middle ground between captivity and wildness. Unlike the breeding center proposed by the Alliance, Whispering Pines operated on a different philosophy, a semi-wild environment where bears could develop natural behaviors while still receiving the support they needed. "He'll have over 200 acres to roam," the sanctuary director explained as they completed the transfer paperwork. "Our approach is minimal human contact, maximum environmental enrichment. If he continues to progress, there's a rewilding program he could eventually qualify for." Sophie nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She held in her hands the care journal she had kept since Kuma's arrival, hundreds of pages documenting every step of his journey, from the broken cub they'd first met to the powerful, recovering bear he had become. "We'd like to place this with him," she said, indicating the journal. "I know it sounds silly." "Not silly at all," the director interrupted gently. "Many of our caretakers leave meaningful objects during transitions. It helps us honor the connection while establishing appropriate boundaries." They followed a staff member to Kuma's acclimation enclosure, A spacious area with natural features that would be his home until he adjusted to the sanctuary. Kuma had traveled well, showing none of the stress behaviors common in bear relocations. Now, he explored his new surroundings with cautious interest, occasionally glancing back at Sophie and Ethan as if checking that they remained nearby. When the time came for final goodbyes, Sophie approached the enclosure boundary. Following the sanctuary protocols, she maintained a safe distance while speaking softly. "Kuma, this is your new home," she told him, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "It's a good place. You'll be safe here. And maybe someday you'll go back to the mountains where you belong." Ethan joined her, his arm around her shoulders. "You did good, buddy," he added simply. As they turned to leave, Sophie placed her journal beneath a young pine tree at the edge of the enclosure, a tree similar to the one Kuma had often rested beneath while gazing at the sky during his time with them. What happened next would become part of Whispering Pine's institutional lore for years to come. Kuma approached the boundary where they stood. Rather than showing the typical bear behaviors of sniffing or standing to investigate, he lowered his massive head until his forehead rested against the protective barrier, directly aligned with Sophie's position on the other side. For a brief, breathtaking moment, they remained this way, separated by necessary boundaries but connected by something deeper than physical proximity. Then, with deliberate gentleness, Kuma drew back, retrieved the journal in his mouth, and carried it to his resting area before setting it down with surprising care. "I've never seen anything like that," the sanctuary director whispered, her professional demeanor momentarily forgotten. That's not typical bear behavior." "No," Sophie agreed, a smile breaking through her tears. "That's Kuma behavior." 1 year later, Ethan and Sophie returned to Whispering Pines. Their research on trauma recovery in wildlife had been published to significant acclaim, and they had secured a substantial grant to expand their work. Part of their visit was professional, collecting follow-up data on Kuma's case, but the personal dimension couldn't be denied. Standing at the observation point overlooking the sanctuary's forest section, they waited with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. According to the staff, Kuma had thrived in the semi-wild environment, gradually reducing his reliance on supplemental feeding and developing strong territorial behaviors. "Do you think he'll remember us?" Sophie asked softly. Ethan squeezed her hand. "I don't know. It's been a year, and he's been going through the rewilding process. It might be better if he doesn't." When the sanctuary staff member called out, "Kuma," as arranged, there was a long moment of stillness. Then, at the forest's edge, a movement caught their eye. A large black bear emerged from the shadows, his coat glossy and healthy, his movements powerful and confident. He was significantly larger than when they'd last seen him, a fully mature black bear in his prime. Kuma stood motionless at the tree-line, his keen nose testing the air. His gaze found them instantly with a directness that left no doubt. He recognized their presence. For a long, breathless minute, he observed them from a distance. Sophie raised her hand in a small wave, unable to help herself. "Hey, Kuma," she called softly. The bear made no move to approach. Instead, after that extended moment of acknowledgement, he turned with quiet dignity and melted back into the forest, not in fear or avoidance, but with the assured independence of a wild creature following his own path. "He knows who we are," Sophie said with certainty, tears of joy rather than sadness welling in her eyes. "But he doesn't need us anymore." Ethan nodded, his own vision blurring. That was always the goal, wasn't it? To help him find his way back to himself. As they turned to leave, a sanctuary staff member approached with a weathered notebook, Sophie's care journal, recovered from Kuma's initial enclosure months earlier. The pages were worn, some bearing the gentle indentations of bare teeth, but the record remained intact, a testament to the journey they had shared. He kept it with him for nearly 6 months, the staff member explained, handing it to Sophie. The director thought you might want it back for your research. Sophie accepted the journal, running her fingers over the cover. Actually, she said after a moment, I think it should stay here. It's part of his story now, not just ours. That evening, as they drove away from Whispering Pines, the setting sun painted the Montana mountains in shades of gold and amber. Sophie gazed out the window, reflecting on the complex journey that had brought them here. You know what I realized today, she said finally. Kuma wasn't just rescued. He rescued us too. He helped me heal from losing my mom, helped us both learn what it means to love something enough to let it go. Ethan reached across the seat to take her hand. The best kind of love isn't possession, he said. It's freedom. As the sanctuary disappeared behind them, they carried with them not the sadness of loss, but the profound satisfaction of having witnessed a remarkable transformation, a broken creature finding his way back to wholeness, and in the process, helping 2 young people discover the true meaning of conservation, healing, and love. The story doesn't end in tears, but in growth, release, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest gift we can offer is the courage to step back and watch something wild and beautiful find its own path home.